On Sunday, the president of Brazil did something heads of state almost never do. He did not call Washington. He did not summon an ambassador. He wrote an opinion column in an American newspaper addressed to the American public and told them their own government had just made a strategic mistake. And here is the part that should make Washington uncomfortable. He may be right, and the mistake may already be paying him political dividends at home. In this video, you are going to find out exactly what Trump signed against Brazil, why some Brazilian goods now carry up to 37.5% in tariffs, what got quietly left off the target list, and why those exemptions tell you more about American strategy than the tariffs themselves, and why several serious analysts now believe this pressure campaign is strengthening the exact leader it was aimed at. Subscribe to PowerMap and turn on notifications because we track how trade power actually works, not how it gets announced. Let us start with what happened because the numbers here stack in a way most coverage has not explained clearly. On July 22, 2026, a 25% tariff took effect on goods from Brazil. It came out of a Section 301 investigation that the United States Trade Representative had been running since the start of the year, examining Brazilian trade, intellectual property, and environmental policies. That investigation concluded on June 1st with a determination that certain Brazilian practices were actionable, and the tariff followed. But 25% is not the whole story, and this is where it connects to something bigger. 2 days after that tariff landed, on July 24th, the United States imposed a separate action on 60 economies at once under the same Section 301 authority, this one justified on forced labor enforcement grounds, adding either 10 or 12.5%. Brazil was on that list too. So Brazilian goods are now absorbing two different tariff actions from the same statute signed within 72 hours of each other, and they stack on top of one another rather than replacing each other. President Lula put the resulting range in his own words in that Washington Post column. He wrote, quote, "This month, disregarding dozens of meetings between our teams, solid technical arguments, and documents I personally handed to President Trump, the U.S. government imposed new tariffs on Brazil, ranging from 12.5% to 37.5%, end quote. Notice what he chose to emphasize there, not the percentage first, the meetings, dozens of them, technical arguments, documents he says he physically handed to Trump. He is not arguing that the tariff is too high. He is arguing that a process happened, that Brazil participated in it in good faith, and that the outcome ignored all of it. That is a very deliberate framing, and it is aimed squarely at an American audience that tends to respond to arguments about fairness and process. Now here is the detail almost nobody is examining, and it is the one that actually reveals the strategy. Look at what was left out. Coffee is exempt, beef is exempt, orange juice is exempt. Aircraft and aircraft parts are exempt, with hundreds of specific carve-outs in that category alone. Rare earths are exempt. Energy products are exempt. In the proposal stage, the exemption list ran to more than 1,000 separate product categories, and it was expanded further before the final action took effect. Sit with that combination for a second, because it is not random. Brazil is the largest coffee producer on earth, and a huge share of what Americans drink every morning comes from Brazilian farms. Brazil is a major beef and orange juice supplier. Those are the three products in this entire trade relationship that an ordinary American household would notice a price change on within weeks. All three were spared. Meanwhile, what actually got hit is machinery, wood products, sugar, and a range of industrial imports, goods that matter enormously to the businesses that buy them, and that almost no consumer can name or price. That is not an accident. That is a tariff engineered to apply maximum pressure on a foreign government while producing minimum visible pain in an American grocery store. And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. because it tells you the real constraint on tariff policy right now is not economic theory or trade law. It is what voters will feel at the checkout. It is worth pausing on why Brazil was targeted at all, because unlike the Canada dispute, this one did not begin with a tariff. It began with an investigation. The United States Trade Representative spent months examining 3 separate areas of Brazilian policy, trade practices, intellectual property enforcement, and environmental policy, before concluding on June 1st that certain practices were actionable under American trade law. That is a meaningfully different process from what happened with Canada, where a 1930 statute was invoked by proclamation with no investigation at all. That difference matters legally. An action built on a completed investigation with a formal determination and a public comment period is considerably harder to challenge in court than one built on a statute nobody has used since 1949. Whatever you think of the outcome, this action followed the procedure that Section 301 was designed around. That is precisely why it has attracted far less legal commentary than the Canada tariffs. And it is also why Brazil's response has focused on economics and politics rather than on litigation. Brazil is not primarily arguing that this is illegal. Brazil is arguing that it is self-defeating. Which brings us to the part of this story that is genuinely surprising, and the reason this video exists. The pressure appears to be backfiring politically, and not in a small way. Reporting in the Washington Post has raised the possibility that these tariffs could tip Brazil's election toward Lula and away from Bolsonaro. Other analysts have made the same argument more bluntly, framing it as Washington handing Lula a campaign gift. Now, to be careful and fair here, that is analysis and reporting, not a settled fact. Elections turn on many things, and nobody can prove a counterfactual. But the logic behind the argument is worth understanding, because it is a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of economic pressure. When a powerful country applies visible, public, unilateral pressure to a smaller one, the immediate political effect inside the smaller country is very often a rally around the flag. Domestic disputes get suspended. The leader in office becomes the person standing up for national dignity. Opposition figures who are perceived as aligned with the pressuring country suddenly find themselves in an impossible position, forced to either defend a foreign government taxing their own economy or abandon a relationship they had built their politics around. That is the trap that opens up here. A candidate positioned as friendly to Washington now has to explain to Brazilian voters why Washington just imposed tariffs on Brazilian machinery and sugar. And the sitting president gets to stand in front of cameras as the person who went to the meetings, handed over the documents, made the technical arguments, and got ignored anyway. That is an extraordinarily strong political position, and it was handed to him for free. There is a broader historical pattern here worth naming. Economic pressure campaigns have a long record of strengthening the governments they target in the short term, even when they succeed in imposing real economic damage. The damage is real, but so is the political consolidation, and the two often arrive together. Pressure creates a visible external adversary, and a visible external adversary is the single most reliable tool for unifying a divided electorate. That does not mean pressure never works. It means the first-order political effect frequently runs opposite to the intended direction, and any strategy that does not account for that is incomplete. Now let us talk about the economics, because the political story does not erase the fact that this is causing genuine damage. Lula noted in his column that Brazilian exports to the United States have fallen to their lowest level since 1997. Think about what that means. Not the lowest in a few years, the lowest in nearly 3 decades. An entire generation of trade relationship, unwound to a level not seen since before the euro existed, before most people had internet at home. And Lula made a specific prediction in that column that deserves attention. because it is the part that should concern American exporters far more than the headline. He wrote, quote, "In the medium term, these tariffs will disrupt supply chains that are currently deeply integrated, and Brazilian companies will replace their U.S. suppliers with partners elsewhere," end quote. That is the same warning Canada has been making, and it is the same warning that has proven accurate in every previous round of this. Tariffs are usually described in terms of the goods they tax. Their durable effect is on the relationships they break. A Brazilian manufacturer who spends 18 months qualifying a new supplier in Europe or Asia because their American supplier became unreliable does not switch back the moment tariffs are lifted. They have already paid the switching cost. The new relationship is established, the contracts are signed, the logistics are worked out. That customer is gone for years, possibly permanently. And Brazil is actively building those alternatives right now. Lula has pointed to progress on the trade agreement between Mercosur, the South American trade bloc, and the European Union, a deal that had been stalled for years and has gained new urgency. He has said explicitly that Brazil is talking with many countries to make up for the losses. Brazil is also a member of the BRICS grouping, which gives it an existing framework for building trade relationships that do not route through Washington. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is precisely what Canada has been doing, deepening ties with Europe and the Pacific while its relationship with Washington deteriorated. Two very different countries on two different continents with two very different governments, arriving at the same strategic response to the same pressure. When your largest customer becomes unpredictable, you do not argue with them forever. You go find other customers. That is the pattern that should genuinely concern anyone thinking about American economic power over the long run. Not any single tariff. The accumulating number of countries independently concluding at the same time that dependence on the American market is a risk to be managed rather than an asset to be relied on. Let us make the damage concrete, because machinery and wood products sound abstract until you picture who is actually holding the invoice. A Brazilian machinery exporter who has spent a decade building a customer base among American manufacturers now watches those customers receive a quote that is 25% higher overnight through no fault of either party. An American factory owner who built a production line around a specific Brazilian machine now faces a repair and parts bill that jumped by a quarter, and switching to a different machine means retraining staff and rebuilding a process. A sugar importer, with contracts signed months ago at prices that no longer work, has to decide whether to absorb the loss or break the contract. None of these people had any role in intellectual property policy or environmental regulation in Brasilia. All of them are paying for it. And this is where the exemption design becomes almost elegant in a cynical way. Every one of those people is a business, not a household. Businesses absorb costs quietly, they renegotiate, they eat margin, they lay off a few people. They do not generate a headline the way a jump in the price of coffee would. The pain is real, it is just structured to be invisible. Brazil has also threatened reciprocal tariffs on American goods. Whether those materialize and at what scale is one of the open questions in the weeks ahead. Brazil is in a different position from Canada here. It is less dependent on the American market overall, with a more diversified export base and a large domestic economy, which gives it somewhat more room to retaliate without inflicting severe damage on itself. But it is also a smaller economy than the United States by a wide margin, and any retaliation carries costs it will feel. There is one more thing about that op-ed worth dwelling on, because the choice of venue was itself a strategic act. Lula did not publish this in a Brazilian newspaper for a Brazilian audience. He published it in Washington, in the newspaper read by the American political class, in English, addressed to Americans. That is a deliberate attempt to go around a government and speak directly to the people it answers to. Leaders do this when they have concluded that the normal channels have stopped working. Lula says he had dozens of meetings and handed documents directly to Trump. If you believe that account, the op-ed is what happens after a leader decides negotiation has failed and public argument is the only remaining lever. It is a low-cost move with a real upside, and it carries a message to a domestic Brazilian audience too, that their president is taking the fight to the other side's home ground rather than absorbing it quietly. One column does not change a tariff, but it does tell you precisely how much confidence Brasilia currently has in private diplomacy, which is to say, almost none. So what should you actually watch from here? First, watch whether Brazil follows through on reciprocal tariffs, and specifically watch which American products get named. As we saw with the exemption list on the American side, the choice of targets tells you the real strategy. If Brazil targets American agricultural exports from politically sensitive states, that is a message aimed at American domestic politics, not at Brazilian trade balances. Second, watch the Mercosur and European Union agreement. It has been stalled for years for reasons that had nothing to do with the United States. If it suddenly accelerates now, that tells you this pressure campaign is actively driving the formation of trade architecture that excludes American participation, which is the opposite of the intended outcome. Third, watch the exemption list itself, because it will change. Exemption lists in every one of these actions have been revised repeatedly under industry pressure. Every product added tells you which American industry successfully argued that it could not absorb the cost. That list is a live map of who actually holds influence in Washington trade policy. Fourth, and most important, watch Brazilian polling. If the analysts arguing that this strengthens Lula are right, it should show up in numbers over the coming weeks. If it does not, then this was a conventional trade action with conventional economic effects and no political dividend, and the rally around the flag theory does not apply here. Either result is genuinely informative, and anyone claiming certainty right now is guessing. And keep one honest caveat in view through all of this. Brazil is not winning here. Exports at a 1997 low is not a victory. It is a wound, and it lands on real Brazilian workers and real Brazilian companies. A leader can gain politically from a crisis, while his country still loses economically. And both of those things are happening at the same time. Anyone selling you a clean story where one side is simply outsmarting the other is flattening something that is genuinely messy. Here is what this all adds up to. The United States imposed 2 separate tariff actions on Brazil within 72 hours, stacking to as much as 37.5% on some goods. It carefully exempted coffee, beef, orange juice, and aircraft parts, the categories where American consumers and American manufacturers would have felt the pain most directly. It hit machinery, wood, and sugar instead, where the pain lands on businesses rather than voters. Brazil's exports to America have fallen to a level not seen since 1997, and the Brazilian president responded not by retaliating first, but by writing directly to the American public in an American newspaper, arguing that this hurts America more than it hurts Brazil, while credible analysts suggest the whole exercise may be strengthening him politically at home. Whether or not you think tariffs are a legitimate tool, that specific combination of outcomes is worth understanding. A policy designed to create leverage may instead have created a stronger adversary, an accelerating trade bloc that excludes you, and a permanent loss of supplier relationships, all while carefully avoiding any consequence an American voter would actually notice. That is not a story about Brazil. That is a story about how modern economic pressure actually works and who ends up paying for it. We will keep tracking this one, the reciprocal tariff decision, the Mercosur and European Union talks, the exemption list revisions, and Brazilian polling. If you want trade coverage that follows the mechanism instead of the headline, that is what this channel is for. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments what you think. Do these tariffs end up forcing Brazil back to the table, Or do they end up pushing Brazil permanently toward Europe and Asia while making Lula stronger at home? I want to hear where you land on this one, because the answer is going to shape a lot more than one trade relationship.